October 14th, 1891. Blood dripped from Elena Cortez's split lip as she stumbled through the Montana wilderness, her father's men closing in with orders to drag her back for a wedding she'd die before accepting. When a lone rancher named Thomas Brennan found her collapsed at his fence line, he made a choice that would put everything he owned, and his life, on the line. But when her father's hired guns arrived at his ranch, demanding she be handed over, would one man's conscience be enough to stand against an army of violence and greed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind cut through the cottonwood trees like a blade as Elena Cortez pressed her back against the barn wall, trying to steady her breathing. Her ribs screamed with every inhale, a reminder of her father's fists just hours before. Through the gap in the wooden slats, she could see the main house of the Cortez estate, its windows glowing with lamplight. Inside, Victor Cortez was likely pouring another whiskey, celebrating the arrangement he'd just finalized with the Drummond family. Elena's fingers trembled as she touched the corner of her mouth, feeling the dried blood crack under her fingertips. She was 23 years old, and tonight her father had informed her that in 2 weeks she would marry Raymond Drummond, a cattle baron twice her age with a reputation for cruelty that extended from his ranch hands to his previous 2 wives, both of whom had died under mysterious circumstances. When she'd refused, her father's response had been immediate and violent. "You'll do as you're told," he'd snarled, backhanding her across the face. "The Drummond alliance secures our water rights and expands our territory. You're a means to an end, girl. Nothing more." Her mother had died when Elena was 12, and in the 11 years since, Victor Cortez had transformed from a stern but fair rancher into something darker, a man consumed by ambition and the acquisition of power. The drought of the past 3 years had made him desperate, and desperate men made dangerous choices. Elena had 3 brothers, but they were mirror images of their father now, cruel, calculating, and convinced that women existed only to serve the family's interests. Diego, the eldest at 30, had held her arms while their father beat her. Miguel and Carlos had watched with cold indifference. She'd waited until the house fell silent near midnight before slipping from her locked bedroom window, taking only what she could carry in a small leather satchel. Some clothing, her mother's silver locket, and the little money she'd hidden away over the years. The plan was simple in theory, terrifying in execution. Reach the town of Clearwater Springs, 30 miles north, and take the first train east. Disappear into a city where the Cortez name meant nothing. The stable master's quarters were dark as she crept past, leading her father's prized mare, Sonrisa, by the reins. The horse knew her well and remained blessedly quiet. Elena's hands shook as she saddled the animal, every creak of leather sounding like thunder in her ears. She was tightening the final strap when she heard voices. "Check the stables again," Diego's voice carried across the yard. "Father wants every building searched." Elena's heart stopped. They'd discovered her absence far sooner than expected. She had minutes, perhaps less. Abandoning stealth for speed, she swung herself into the saddle and dug her heels into Sonrisa's flanks. The mare bolted from the stable just as lamplight flooded the doorway behind them. "There!" Miguel's shout pierced the night. "She's making for the north road." Gunshots cracked through the air, and Elena bent low over Sonrisa's neck, urging the horse faster. The mare was swift, but Elena could hear the thunder of hooves behind her. At least 3 riders, maybe more. Her father wouldn't let her escape easily. She represented too much. The Drummond alliance, water rights worth a fortune, and Victor Cortez's absolute authority over his household. The dirt road stretched before her, silvered by moonlight, but Elena knew she couldn't outrun them on the main route. Instead, She yanked the reins hard left, sending Sonrisa crashing through brush and into the wilderness. The terrain here was treacherous, rocky outcroppings, hidden gullies, and thick stands of pine that could hide a rider or break a horse's leg with equal ease. Behind her she heard Diego shouting orders, the pursuit spreading out to cover more ground. They were experienced trackers, these men. They'd hunted everything from elk to fugitive ranch hands. Elena was just another piece of property to be retrieved. Sonrisa's breathing grew labored as they climbed higher into the foothills. Elena's own breath came in ragged gasps, each one sending fresh pain through her bruised ribs. The cold October air bit at her exposed skin, and she realized with growing horror that she'd left without a proper coat in her haste. A branch whipped across her face, and she tasted blood again. The pursuit seemed to be falling back slightly, or perhaps they were simply being more cautious in the darkness. Elena allowed herself a moment of hope, a dangerous thing in her current situation. That hope died when Sonrisa's hoof caught on a hidden root. The mare stumbled, trying valiantly to recover, but the momentum was wrong. Elena felt herself being thrown, had just enough time to kick free of the stirrups before she hit the ground hard. The impact drove the air from her lungs and sent white-hot pain exploding through her injured ribs. She lay gasping like a landed fish, trying to force her body to move, to run, to do anything but lie there helpless. Sonrisa had regained her footing and stood nearby, but the mare was favoring her right foreleg, not broken, Elena prayed, but certainly injured. In the distance, she could hear the pursuers, their voices carrying through the trees. They were perhaps 10 minutes behind, maybe 15, not enough time to remount and continue, especially not on an injured horse. Elena forced herself to her feet, swaying with dizziness and pain. She could leave Sonrisa. The horse would likely find her way back home eventually. The thought made Elena's heart ache, but survival demanded harsh choices. She stumbled forward, on foot, her satchel somehow still slung across her body. The terrain sloped downward and she half ran, half fell through the darkness, branches tearing at her clothes and skin. Blood ran into her left eye from a gash on her forehead she didn't remember receiving. The trees began to thin, and Elena could make out a fence line ahead, wooden posts and wire marking the boundary of someone's property. Beyond it, she could see open rangeland, and in the far distance, a small cluster of buildings barely visible in the moonlight. She'd reached the edge of the Cortez territory, but whose land lay beyond? Friend or foe? In this part of Montana, loyalty often ran to whoever had the most money or the most guns, and Victor Cortez had both. Behind her, much closer now, Diego's voice rang out, "Fresh tracks! She's on foot and bleeding! Spread out and close in!" Elena threw herself at the fence, scrambling over it with desperate strength. A barb caught her arm, tearing through fabric and flesh, but she barely felt it. On the other side, she ran toward those distant buildings with everything she had left. Her vision was starting to blur at the edges, whether from exhaustion, blood loss, or shock, she couldn't tell. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet, and twice she fell, forcing herself up through sheer will alone. The buildings resolved into clearer shapes. A ranch house, modest but well-maintained, a barn, some outbuildings. No lights showed in any windows. It must be past 2 in the morning now. Would anyone hear if she screamed for help? And if they did, would they shelter her or hand her back to her father for a reward? Elena made it another 100 yards before her legs finally gave out. She collapsed near what looked like a water trough, her body simply refusing to obey any longer. Through the ringing in her ears, she could hear her pursuers reaching the fence line. "Whose property is this?" Carlos asked. "Brennan's place," Miguel answered. "Thomas Brennan. Keeps to himself mostly. Small operation." "Father will pay him well for the girl," Diego said with certainty. "Search the grounds." Elena tried to crawl further, to hide, to do anything, but darkness was closing in fast. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was the ranch house door opening, lamplight spilling out, and the silhouette of a man stepping onto the porch. Then everything went black. Thomas Brennan had learned long ago that nothing good happened after midnight on a ranch. Livestock predators, cattle thieves, or worse, the darkness brought trouble more often than not. When his dog, a gray muzzled cattle dog named Rebel, started barking frantically at the door, Thomas knew sleep was over for the night. He was 41 years old, weathered by sun and hard work, with the kind of lean strength that came from a lifetime of physical labor. His wife Sarah had died of pneumonia 6 years ago, leaving him to run the ranch alone except for 2 seasonal hands who'd already left for the winter. The solitude suited him most days, though the silence of the house sometimes pressed down like a physical weight. Thomas grabbed his rifle from above the door and stepped onto the porch, Rebel pushing past his legs to race towards the water trough. That's when he saw her, a young woman collapsed in his yard, her clothing torn and bloodied, clearly unconscious. His eyes immediately scanned the darkness beyond his fence line. Nobody ended up in his yard like this by accident. He could hear horses in the distance, voices carrying on the night wind, men searching for something, or someone. Thomas made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. He slung the rifle over his shoulder, scooped the woman into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and carried her quickly into the house. Rebel followed, still growling low in his throat. Inside, Thomas laid her carefully on his sofa and lit another lamp. In better light, he could assess the damage. She was young, mid-20s perhaps, with dark hair matted with blood from a gash on her forehead. Her face was swollen and bruised. Someone had beaten her badly. Her dress was torn in several places, revealing more bruises on her arms and a nasty cut that was still bleeding. He recognized the quality of her clothing despite its current state. This was no ranch hand or drifter. The silver locket around her neck, the fine leather boots. She came from money. Thomas was cleaning the head wound, trying to be gentle, when someone pounded on his door. He covered the woman with a blanket and positioned himself between her and the entrance before calling out, "Who's there?" "Diego Cortez, open up, Brennan. We're looking for someone." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He knew the Cortez family by reputation. Everyone in 3 counties did. Victor Cortez ran one of the largest ranching operations in Montana, and his methods for maintaining that empire were ruthless. Thomas had always kept his distance, refusing several offers to sell his land to the expanding Cortez holdings. He opened the door but stood blocking the entrance, rifle held casually but ready. 3 men faced him. Diego and 2 others he assumed were brothers based on their resemblance. All 3 were armed, and all 3 looked like they knew how to use their weapons. "Mr. Cortez," Thomas said evenly, "it's late." "We're tracking a runaway," Diego said, his eyes trying to peer past Thomas into the house. "A young woman, injured, dark hair. She crossed onto your property about 15 minutes ago. You seen her?" Thomas met Diego's gaze without flinching. "Haven't seen anyone. What's she run away from?" "Family matter," Miguel cut in. "None of your concern. Our father is prepared to pay handsomely for information leading to her recovery." "How much?" Thomas asked, letting a note of interest creep into his voice. Diego smiled, thinking he'd found his angle. $500, gold, just for pointing us in the right direction. $500 was more than Thomas made in a good year. It was enough to buy new breeding stock, repair his barn roof, maybe even hire permanent help. It was the kind of money a struggling rancher couldn't easily refuse. "That's generous," Thomas said slowly, "but I haven't seen her. Rebel would have raised hell if anyone came through my yard." "Mind if we look around?" Carlos asked, already moving toward the porch steps. Thomas shifted his position slightly, the rifle moving with him. Actually, I do mind. It's my property, and I don't take kindly to armed men searching it without cause, especially at 3 in the morning. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Diego's smile vanished. You're making a mistake, Brennan. Victor Cortez is not a man you want as an enemy. Never wanted him as anything, Thomas replied. But I'm particular about who I let on my land. Call it a quirk. Miguel's hand moved toward his pistol, but Diego stopped him with a gesture. Your land borders ours to the south. You depend on the same water sources, the same grazing access. Things can get difficult for a small operation like yours if the wrong people decide to make them difficult. Are you threatening me on my own porch, Mr. Cortez? I'm explaining reality, Diego said coldly. If you're hiding her, you're stealing Cortez property. That makes you a thief, and we deal harshly with thieves. Thomas felt anger rising, but kept his voice level. Nobody hiding here but me and my dog. Now get off my property before I decide you're trespassing with intent to threaten. For a long moment, the 4 men stood in the tense standoff. Thomas could see Diego calculating, weighing options. Finally, the eldest Cortez brother stepped back. We'll be watching this place, he said. If she shows up, you contact us immediately. That's not a request. Thomas didn't respond, just watched as the 3 men mounted their horses and rode toward his southern fence line. They didn't leave. He could see them setting up positions at various points along the boundary, dark shapes against the moonlit landscape. They were laying siege to his ranch. Thomas closed and barred the door, then returned to the woman on his sofa. Her eyes were open now, wide with fear and pain, watching him with the wariness of a trapped animal. Easy, he said softly, kneeling beside her. You're safe. For now. They'll kill you, she whispered, her voice hoarse. My father. He'll kill anyone who helps me. Your father being Victor Cortez, I take it? She nodded, wincing at the movement. Elena, my name is Elena. Thomas Brennan, and I've got to tell you, Elena, you've put me in one hell of a situation. He said it without malice, just stating fact. I'm sorry. Tears began tracking down her bruised face. I didn't know where else to go. I'll leave as soon as I can move. You can tell them you never saw me. Thomas stood and walked to his window, looking out at the men positioned around his property. Little late for that. They know you crossed my fence line. Even if you leave now, they'll assume I helped you. Besides, he turned back to her. You can barely sit up, let alone travel. That head wound alone probably gave you a concussion. Then what do we do? Elena asked, desperation clear in her voice. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Sarah, about the vows they'd made in their small church wedding, about how she'd always helped anyone who needed it, regardless of the cost, about how she'd faced down a mountain lion once to protect an injured calf, armed with nothing but a shovel and pure stubbornness. What would Sarah do? He already knew the answer. We make our stand, Thomas said finally. Come morning, I'll ride into Clearwater Springs and fetch the sheriff. Victor Cortez may have money and guns, but we still have laws in Montana. Sheriff Morton is on my father's payroll, Elena said bitterly. Half the town is. My father owns the bank, the largest mercantile, the land office. Who do you think the sheriff will side with? Thomas felt his stomach sink. She was probably right. He'd been operating on the assumption that civilization and law would protect them, but money had a way of twisting justice in its favor. Then we need someone who can't be bought, he said. Federal marshal, maybe. Territorial judge. By the time they arrive, we'll both be dead, Elena said. You don't understand. My father has 20 men working for him, gunmen, most of them. He's trying to force me to marry Raymond Drummond to secure a business alliance. When I refused, she touched her swollen face. This happened, and it will be worse if they take me back. Thomas moved to his gun cabinet and began checking his weapons: 2 rifles, a shotgun, and his service revolver from his brief stint in the cavalry 20 years ago. Not much against 20 armed men, but better than nothing. "How long can you hold them off?" Elena asked quietly. "Long enough," Thomas said, though he had no idea if that was true. "This house has good sight lines, strong walls. They come at us, they'll pay for every foot of ground." "Why are you doing this?" Elena's voice cracked. "You don't know me. I'm nothing to you. $500, that's a fortune for a rancher. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now, back to the story. Thomas looked at her, at this terrified young woman who'd been beaten by her own family and was now hunted like an animal. He thought about Sarah again, about the kind of man she'd married and the kind of man he'd promised to be. "Because it's right," he said simply. "Your father's money doesn't give him ownership of you, and I'll be damned before I hand a helpless woman over to men who mean her harm." Outside, he could hear horses moving, men talking in low voices. They were settling in, preparing for whatever came next. The siege had begun. Dawn came slowly to the Montana foothills, bleeding pale light across the horizon. Thomas hadn't slept. He'd spent the night watching from different windows, tracking the positions of the Cortez men as they maintained their cordon around his property. They'd built a small fire on the south ridge. Arrogant or stupid, he couldn't decide which. Either way, it told him they weren't leaving. Elena had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep around 4 in the morning. Thomas had cleaned and bandaged her wounds as best he could, though she clearly needed a proper doctor. The gash on her forehead had required 6 careful stitches that he'd done by lamplight, his hands steadier than he felt. She'd bitten down on a leather strap and hadn't made a sound, which told him more about her strength than any words could. Now, as sunlight strengthened, Thomas could see the full scope of his situation. 6 men visible around the perimeter, Diego and his brothers plus 3 others. Probably more he couldn't see. They'd positioned themselves strategically, covering all approaches to and from the ranch. No one was getting in or out without their knowledge. Rebel lay near the door, ears pricked forward, sensing his master's tension. The dog had been Sarah's favorite, and Thomas sometimes thought the animal still looked for her, expecting her to come through the door any moment. "How bad is it?" Elena's voice came from the sofa, rough with sleep and pain. Thomas turned from the window. She'd managed to sit up, though the effort clearly cost her. In daylight, the extent of her injuries was even more apparent. The purple-black bruising across her cheekbone, the split lip, the way she held her left side protectively. "6 men I can see," Thomas said. "They're dug in for a long wait." Elena closed her eyes briefly. "My father won't negotiate. He'll wait us out, cut off your water access, kill your livestock if necessary. He'll make this place a prison until you give up or he decides to attack directly." "Then we need to change the game," Thomas said. He poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and brought it to her. "There's a line cabin about 8 miles north of here, just over the ridge. Old trapper's place I used during winter grazing. It's remote, well hidden. If I could get you there, you'd have time to heal while I figure out our next move." "You can't get through their line," Elena said, accepting the water gratefully. "They'll have men watching every trail." "Not every trail. There's a passage through Widow's Canyon that most people don't know about. Narrow, dangerous, but it comes out near the line cabin. I've used it before when driving cattle." "Widow's Canyon?" Elena's eyes widened. "That's named for a reason. How many people have died trying to cross it?" "In the old days, quite a few," Thomas admitted. "But I know the path. Made it through last spring without losing a single head of cattle." Before Elena could respond, a shout came from outside. "Brennan, come out and talk!" Thomas recognized Diego's voice. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, keeping the doorframe as cover. Diego sat on horseback about 50 yards away, flanked by two men Thomas didn't recognize. Hard-faced men with the look of professional gunfighters rather than ranch hands. "Nothing to talk about, Cortez," Thomas called back. "My father arrived an hour ago," Diego announced. "He'd like to speak with you, man to man. He's prepared to make this worth your while." Thomas spotted another rider emerging from the tree line, an older man on a black stallion, sitting straight-backed despite his age. Victor Cortez, in the flesh. Even from this distance, Thomas could sense the man's authority, the casual certainty of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. "Send him forward," Thomas said after a moment, alone and unarmed. Diego started to protest, but Victor raised a hand. The older man dismounted, unbuckled his gun belt, and handed it to his son, then walked slowly across the open ground to Thomas's porch. Up close, Victor Cortez was an imposing figure, silver-haired with eyes like flint and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades building an empire in hostile territory. "Mr. Brennan," Victor said, his voice cultured despite the frontier setting, "I believe you have something of mine." "I have a guest on my property," Thomas replied. "That's all." "A guest who arrived bleeding and fleeing from her family in the middle of the night?" Victor's smile held no warmth. "Let's not insult each other's intelligence. My daughter is troubled, Mr. Brennan. She's been difficult since her mother died, prone to hysterics, irrational fears. Last night she had another episode. In her confused state, she injured herself and ran off. We're simply trying to bring her home where she can be cared for." The lie was delivered so smoothly that Thomas almost admired the craft of it. Almost. "That's so," Thomas said, "because those bruises on her face look like someone's fists, not like she hurt herself falling down." Victor's expression didn't change. "My daughter is my responsibility, not yours. I'm prepared to compensate you generously for your trouble. $1,000 in gold. All you need to do is bring her out, and we'll leave your property immediately." $1,000. Thomas felt the weight of that number. It was enough to expand his herd, buy the Henderson property next door that he'd had his eye on, set himself up comfortably for years to come. "What happens to her?" Thomas asked. "After you take her home?" "She receives the care she needs," Victor said smoothly. "Medical attention, rest, proper supervision. And in 2 weeks, she'll be married to a good man who can provide for her better than I can. Raymond Drummond is a respected businessman, a man of standing in the territory." "I've heard of Drummond," Thomas said carefully. "Heard he's buried 2 wives already." "Tragic accidents, both of them," Victor said without missing a beat. "But irrelevant to the current situation. Do we have an arrangement, Mr. Brennan?" Thomas met the older man's eyes and saw something there that chilled him. Absolute conviction that Elena was property to be disposed of as Victor saw fit. There was no love in that gaze, no paternal concern, only the cold calculation of a businessman protecting his interests. "No deal," Thomas said. Victor's facade cracked slightly. "You're making a grave mistake. I could have my men storm this house. You'd be dead within the hour." "Maybe," Thomas agreed, "but you'd lose men doing it, maybe several, and your daughter might get caught in the crossfire. That wouldn't look good for your reputation, killing your own daughter while trying to force her into a marriage." "No one would believe that version of events," Victor said coldly. "They'd believe mine, that a deranged rancher kidnapped a confused young woman and died resisting lawful attempts to rescue her." "Sheriff Morton might agree with you," Thomas said, "but there are other authorities, territorial governor, federal marshals, newspapers in Helena and Billings. Sometimes the truth has a way of spreading, especially when it's an interesting story." Cattle baron forces daughter into marriage, kills man who sheltered her. That'd make headlines all the way to Washington. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Victor's face. Thomas had found his leverage, not law or justice, but reputation and publicity. Men like Victor Cortez built their empires on perception as much as reality. A scandal could damage business relationships, draw unwanted scrutiny from territorial authorities, make other powerful men reluctant to associate with him. "What do you want?" Victor asked, his voice tight. "Safe passage for Elena. Let her go. Let her live her own life. She's not property, Cortez. She's a person." Victor's laugh was bitter. "You have no idea how the world works, do you? Everything is property, Brennan. Land, cattle, water rights, people, especially people. My daughter represents an alliance worth tens of thousands of dollars in water access and grazing rights. The Drummond marriage secures my position for the next 20 years. You expect me to throw that away because some small-time rancher has romantic notions about freedom? I expect you to be a father instead of a businessman," Thomas said quietly. "Then you're a fool." Victor turned and walked back toward his men, calling over his shoulder, "You have until sunset to reconsider. After that, we come in, and I promise you, Mr. Brennan, you won't survive it." Thomas watched him mount and ride back to the ridge. The threat was real. He could feel it in his bones. Come nightfall, they'd attack. 6 men minimum, possibly more, against one rancher with limited ammunition and a wounded woman to protect. He went back inside. Elena had dragged herself to the window and watched the entire exchange. "You should have taken the money," she said softly. "Probably," Thomas agreed. "Never been good at doing the smart thing." He checked his rifle, his mind already working through possibilities. "We've got maybe 12 hours before they make their move. That's not enough time to get you to the line cabin, not in your condition. Which means we need another plan." "What kind of plan?" Thomas looked at her. This woman he'd known for less than a day, but had already decided was worth fighting for. Not because of any romantic notion, he was too old and too practical for that, but because some things mattered more than survival. Some lines you didn't cross, no matter the cost. "The kind where we make them think twice about coming through that door," he said. "And maybe, if we're lucky, we live to see tomorrow." Outside, the sun climbed higher, counting down the hours until darkness fell and violence came calling. Thomas moved through his house with methodical efficiency, years of military training coming back to him like muscle memory. The cavalry had taught him how to defend a position against superior numbers, and though that had been 2 decades ago, the principles remained sound. "Can you load a rifle?" he asked Elena as he began dragging furniture towards the windows. She nodded, pushing herself to her feet despite visible pain. "My brothers used to take me hunting before my mother died and everything changed. I'm a decent shot." "Good." Thomas handed her his Winchester repeater and a box of cartridges. "You take the east window. Anyone tries to approach from that direction, you make them regret it. Don't aim to kill unless you have to, but make sure they know you're serious." Elena checked the rifle's action with practiced ease, and Thomas felt a small measure of relief. She wasn't helpless, which improved their odds marginally. He spent the next hour transforming his modest ranch house into a defensible position. Heavy furniture barricaded the lower portions of windows, providing cover while still allowing sight lines. He filled every bucket, pot, and container with water, not just for drinking, but in case the Cortez men tried to burn them out. The rain barrel outside became a strategic concern. It was too exposed to risk fetching water once the shooting started. Thomas's root cellar held dried meat, canned vegetables, flour, and coffee, enough to last weeks if necessary. His ammunition situation was less encouraging. maybe 200 rounds total across all his weapons, and that was counting the older cartridges he wasn't entirely certain would fire properly. "They'll try to wait us out first," Thomas said, thinking aloud as he worked. "Cutting off water access, maybe killing livestock to eliminate our food supply. Victor doesn't want the publicity of an all-out assault if he can avoid it." "Unless you gave him no choice," Elena said from her position by the window. "You humiliated him out there. He'll want blood for that." Thomas paused, considering. She was right. Men like Victor Cortez didn't tolerate public defiance. The longer Thomas held out, the weaker Victor appeared to his men and anyone else watching. A thought struck him. "Who else knows you ran?" "What do you mean?" "Your father's household. Servants, ranch hands, people in town. Who knows Victor Cortez is out here trying to force his daughter back into an arranged marriage?" Elena's eyes widened as she understood. "The house staff saw him beat me, at least 3 of them, and some of the ranch hands heard the shouting, but they're all loyal to my father. They won't talk." "Maybe, maybe not." Thomas moved to his desk and pulled out paper and pencil. "Fear keeps people silent, but the right incentive can loosen tongues. If word got to the territorial governor about what's really happening here." "You want to send a letter?" Elena looked skeptical. "How? We're surrounded." "Not yet, we're not. Not completely." Thomas wrote quickly, his handwriting rough but legible. He detailed the situation, named names, described Elena's injuries. He addressed it to Territorial Governor Samuel Hauser in Helena, a man known for his intolerance of corruption and violence against women. "There's a kid who works at the telegraph office in Clearwater Springs," Thomas continued. "Billy Patterson, good kid, honest. He owes me a favor. I paid for his mother's medicine last winter when they couldn't afford it. If I can get this letter to him, he'll make sure it reaches Helena." "That's 12 miles through hostile territory," Elena pointed out. "You'd never make it." "I wouldn't, but there's another option." Thomas moved to his back door and whistled sharply. Moments later, Rebel trotted over, tail wagging. Thomas knelt and scratched the dog's ears. "Old boy here knows the way to the Patterson place. I've sent him with messages before when I needed supplies from town." He attached the sealed letter to Rebel's collar in a small leather pouch, then walked the dog to the back door, the side of the house not visible from the Cortez positions. "Go to Billy," Thomas commanded, pointing north. "Go on, boy. Billy, Patterson Place." Rebel looked at him with intelligent brown eyes, then bolted through the door and disappeared into the brush. Thomas watched until the dog vanished over a rise, then closed and barred the door. "Will he make it?" Elena asked. "If anyone can slip through their line, it's Rebel. He's fast, smart, and knows every rabbit trail in these hills." Thomas returned to his preparations, trying not to think about the fact that he'd just sent his last connection to Sarah, running into danger. Around midday, Diego called out again. "Brennan, my father wants you to know your water's been cut off. That stream running through your property, we've dammed it upstream. You've got what's in your well and nothing else. How long do you think you can last?" Thomas checked his well, still producing, but sluggishly. They must have done something to the underground flow as well. He had maybe 3 days of water if he rationed carefully. "Also," Diego continued, sounding almost cheerful, "we've taken the liberty of shooting some of your cattle. Nothing personal, just incentive for you to see reason. Every hour you delay costs you another head. You've got, 40 cattle total? Do the math, Brennan." Thomas moved to the west window and saw 2 of his cows lying dead in the far pasture. Rage burned in his chest, but he forced it down. Anger made you careless, and careless got you killed. Elena appeared beside him, her face pale. "I'm so sorry. This is my fault. All of this." "No," Thomas said firmly. "This is your father's fault. He's the one choosing violence. He's the one treating his daughter like livestock to be traded. Don't you dare take responsibility for his sins." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Tell me about your wife. You wear a ring, but she's not here." Thomas glanced at the gold band on his finger, worn thin by years of work. "Sarah. She died 6 years ago. Pneumonia took her in 3 days. By the time I got the doctor out here, it was too late." He smiled sadly at the memory. "She was tougher than me in every way that mattered. Would have faced down your father without blinking." "She sounds remarkable." "She was." Thomas turned back to the window. "She used to say that character is what you do when it costs you something. When doing the right thing is easy, everyone's a saint. But when it costs you everything, that's when you find out who you really are." "What's this costing you?" Elena asked quietly. Thomas looked around his house, the home he'd built with Sarah, filled with memories of her laughter, her cooking, her presence in every corner. He thought about his cattle dying in the field, his water being cut off, the very real possibility that he'd be dead by morning. "Everything," he admitted, "but Sarah would have done the same, and I won't dishonor her memory by being less than she believed I was." Movement outside caught his attention. More riders approaching from the south, reinforcements. Thomas counted 5 additional men, bringing the total to at least 11 that he could see. The odds were getting worse by the hour. One of the new arrivals was Raymond Drummond himself. Thomas recognized him from town, a thick-bodied man in his 50s with a beard shot through with gray and eyes that lingered too long on young women. He rode up to confer with Victor, and Thomas could see Elena tense beside him. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the man they want to force me to marry." Thomas watched Drummond gesture animatedly, clearly angry about something. The cattle baron pointed at the house, and Thomas could read his body language even from this distance. He wanted to attack now, consequences be damned. Victor appeared to be counseling patience, but Drummond wasn't having it. The argument escalated, voices rising, though Thomas couldn't make out words. Finally, Victor raised his hands in a placating gesture, and Drummond stormed back to his horse. "That's not good," Thomas muttered. "Drummond just changed the equation. He's got his own men, his own interests. Your father might have been willing to wait us out, but Drummond wants this settled now." "He's not patient," Elena confirmed. "My brothers used to joke about his temper. He once beat a ranch hand nearly to death for talking back to him. The man was never right in the head afterward." Thomas did a quick inventory of his defenses. Furniture barricades, adequate but not perfect. Ammunition, limited. Food and water, sufficient for a few days. Manpower, 1 injured woman and himself against 11 or more armed men. The mathematics of survival were not in their favor. As if confirming his thoughts, gunfire suddenly cracked across the yard. Thomas and Elena both dropped instinctively, but the shots weren't aimed at the house. They were shooting more cattle. Thomas watched helplessly as 3 more of his herd fell. "Just to show we're serious, Brennan," Diego shouted. "Sunset's still the deadline, but every hour costs you. Cattle, water, eventually your life. How much are you willing to lose for a woman you don't even know?" Thomas didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would change anything. Elena touched his arm. "There's still time for you to reconsider. Tell them I forced you at gunpoint to hide me. They might believe it. You could survive this." "No," Thomas said simply. "I couldn't. Not the way that matters." They settled in to wait, watching the sun arc across the Montana sky, each passing hour bringing them closer to the moment when talk would end and violence would begin. Outside, the Cortez men built their fires and cleaned their weapons, confident in their numbers and their ultimate victory. Inside, Thomas and Elena prepared to make their stand, knowing that courage and righteousness were poor shields against bullets, but refusing to surrender regardless. The sun continued its descent toward the western mountains, indifferent to the blood that would soon be spilled in its fading light. The afternoon dragged on with excruciating slowness. Thomas kept moving between windows, tracking the positions of the Cortez men, noting their patterns and habits. Miguel smoked incessantly, going through what must have been a dozen cigarettes. Carlos kept checking his pocket watch, impatient. The hired guns remained professional and alert, which worried Thomas more than the brothers' agitation. Around 3 o'clock, Elena suddenly gasped and pointed toward the eastern tree line. There, movement in the pines. Thomas grabbed his spyglass and focused where she'd indicated. For a moment he saw nothing, then caught a flash of gray fur moving through the shadows. His heart lifted. "Rebel," he breathed. He made it back. But something was wrong. The dog was limping badly, and as he drew closer, Thomas could see blood matting his fur. One of the Cortez men must have spotted him and taken a shot. "Come on, boy," Thomas whispered, willing the animal to make it the final 100 yards. Almost home. Rebel broke from the tree line at a stumbling run, heading straight for the back door. Gunfire erupted immediately. The Cortez men had been watching for exactly this. Bullets kicked up dirt around the dog as Thomas threw open the door. "Covering fire," he shouted to Elena. She immediately began shooting from her window, not aiming to hit, but forcing the gunman to take cover. Thomas darted out, grabbed Rebel by the collar and hauled him inside as bullets splintered the doorframe inches from his head. Once inside, Thomas examined the dog quickly. A grazing wound along his ribs, painful and bleeding, but not fatal. He cleaned and wrapped it, while Elena kept watch. "Did he have a response?" she asked. Thomas checked Rebel's collar. The original pouch was still there, but now there was a second one attached. Inside was a hastily scrawled note. "Mr. Brennan," message sent via telegraph to Helena and Billings newspapers as well as governor's office. Also contacted Judge Morrison, who was passing through Clearwater. He's riding out with a federal marshal and should arrive by tomorrow afternoon. Hold out if you can. Town is talking. Words spreading about what Cortez is really doing. You're not alone. B. Patterson Thomas read it twice, then showed it to Elena. For the first time since she'd collapsed in his yard, he saw hope flicker across her face. "Tomorrow afternoon," she said. "That's only 24 hours. "If we survive tonight," Thomas added, but he was smiling. "But this changes things. If a federal marshal and territorial judge are coming, Victor has to know his options just got a lot more limited." Almost as if responding to his thoughts, Diego called out again, "New offer, Brennan. 2,500 in gold and safe passage off your property. You take the money, we take the girl. Everyone lives. Last chance before dark." Thomas moved to the window. "I've got a counteroffer, Cortez. You and your men ride out now, and when the federal marshal arrives tomorrow, I'll testify that you left peacefully. Stay, and you're all complicit in kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder." The silence that followed was profound. Thomas could see Victor and Diego conferring urgently, their body language tense. His gambit had worked. They knew about the telegraph. "You're bluffing," Diego finally shouted back, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Billy Patterson sent telegraphs to Helena and Billings an hour ago," Thomas called. "The territorial governor knows what you're doing here, Victor. So do the newspapers. How's that going to look for your business dealings? Think the Drummond alliance is worth that kind of scandal?" More heated discussion among the Cortez group. Raymond Drummond had joined them, his face purple with rage, even at this distance. He was gesturing violently, clearly pushing for immediate action. Victor finally stepped forward. "You've made this more complicated than it needed to be, Brennan, but it doesn't matter. By the time any marshal arrives, this will be over. My daughter will be back home, and you'll be buried on your own property. Self-defense. A man went mad, kidnapped a young woman, had to be stopped." With a federal judge coming, you really want to bet on that story? Thomas challenged. I'm betting on the fact that dead men can't testify. Victor's veneer of civility had completely cracked. Elena, if you can hear me, know this. Come out now, come willingly, and Brennan lives. Stay hidden, and his blood is on your hands. Elena moved beside Thomas, her jaw set. Don't listen to him, he's lying. He'll kill you either way. I know, Thomas said quietly. Then, louder, she's not coming out, Victor, and your deadline just changed. You want to attack? Do it. But every bullet fired, every drop of blood spilled, that's evidence for the marshal. You're not just fighting me anymore, you're fighting the law itself. The bluff was audacious, maybe even foolish, but Thomas could see it working. The hired gunmen were exchanging glances, calculating new risk versus reward. Federal charges meant territorial prison or hanging, and no amount of Cortez money was worth that. Two of the gunmen actually mounted their horses and rode off toward the south. Victor screamed at them to stop, but they ignored him. In the span of 5 minutes, the siege force had dropped from 11 to 9. But 9 was still more than enough to overwhelm 2 defenders in an isolated ranch house. Drummond had apparently had enough of waiting. He drew his pistol and fired 3 shots at the house. Wild, angry shots that splintered wood but hit nothing vital. Enough talk. We're going in at sunset, whether Victor approves or not. I paid good money for that girl, and I'm not leaving without her. That statement hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena went rigid beside Thomas. He paid? She whispered. Like I was livestock? Thomas felt his anger surge fresh and hot. Whatever sympathy he might have had for Victor as a father evaporated. The man hadn't just arranged a marriage. He'd sold his daughter outright. How much? Thomas called out before he could stop himself. How much did Drummond pay for her? Victor's silence was answer enough. Drummond, in his rage, wasn't as cautious. 30,000 in cash and water rights to the Eastern Basin, a fortune for one spoiled girl who doesn't know her place. Elena's hand went to her mouth. 30,000. He sold me for $30,000. The sun was dropping toward the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, beautiful and terrible. Thomas estimated maybe 90 minutes until full dark, when the attack would come. He needed to think, to plan, to find some advantage that would let them survive the night. His mind raced through possibilities, discarding most as quickly as they formed. The root cellar, Elena said suddenly. Could I hide there? If they break in, they might not find me immediately. They'd tear this house apart, Thomas said. Root cellar would be one of the first places they'd look. No, if we're going to survive this, we need to make them think twice about coming through that door. An idea began forming, risky and desperate, but possibly their best chance. Thomas moved to his workshop corner and pulled out a collection of glass bottles. Whiskey bottles, mostly empty. He also grabbed his can of kerosene for the lamps. What are you doing? Elena asked. Making them pay for every foot, Thomas said, filling bottles with kerosene and stuffing rags into the necks. Molotov cocktails. The cavalry used them against entrenched positions in the Indian Wars. They won't expect it from a rancher. He created 6 bottles, lining them up near the windows. Then he took rope from his barn supplies and began rigging a crude alarm system. Tin cans on strings that would rattle if anyone tried to come through a window. Elena watched him work, then said quietly, I never thanked you for all of this, for risking everything when you didn't have to. Thank me when we're both still breathing tomorrow, Thomas replied, but his tone was gentle. If we don't make it, she started. We'll make it. But if we don't, she insisted, I want you to know that you gave me something I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. The belief that there are still good men in the world who do the right thing not because it benefits them, but because it's right. My father took that from me. You gave it back. Thomas met her eyes and saw the same determination he felt. They were going to fight, and they were going to survive, because the alternative was surrendering to men who viewed human beings as property. "We'll make it," he repeated, this time like a promise. Outside, the sun touched the mountains, and long shadows stretched across the ranch yard. The Cortez men began preparing in earnest, checking weapons, tightening saddle cinches, the methodical preparations of men about to commit violence. Victor called out one final time, "Last chance, Brennan. Send her out, or we're coming in." Thomas didn't bother responding. He took position at the main window, rifle ready, and Elena moved to hers. The waiting was almost over. As darkness began to fall over the Montana foothills, two people prepared to defend a principle against overwhelming force, knowing that sometimes the cost of dignity was measured in blood, and that some fights were worth having even when you couldn't win. The siege was about to become a battle. Darkness came to the ranch like a shroud, and with it came the silence of predators preparing to strike. Thomas had extinguished all lamps inside the house, relying on moonlight filtering through the windows. His eyes had adjusted to the gloom, and he could make out Elena's silhouette across the room, rifle barrel resting on the windowsill. The fires outside had been doused an hour ago. The Cortez men had vanished into the shadows, which meant they were maneuvering into position. Thomas's pulse thrummed steadily in his ears, a rhythm he remembered from his cavalry days, the body's preparation for violence. Then he heard it, the faint creak of a boot on wood. Someone was on his porch. Thomas raised his rifle slowly, sighting along the barrel toward the front door. The doorknob turned fractionally, testing. Finding it barred, the intruder retreated. Seconds later, Thomas heard the distinctive scratch of metal on glass. Someone trying to pry open a window on the south side. "East window," Elena whispered urgently. Thomas looked and saw a dark shape climbing through, silhouetted against the night sky. Elena's rifle cracked, and the figure tumbled backward with a scream. First blood drawn, and it wasn't theirs. All hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions simultaneously, bullets shattering windows and punching through walls. Thomas dropped below his barricade as wood splinters showered over him. This was suppressing fire, meant to keep them pinned while others advanced. "Stay down," he shouted to Elena, though she'd already taken cover. Through the cacophony, Thomas heard boots hitting his porch. At least 3 men rushing the front door. He grabbed one of his kerosene bottles, lit the rag with a match, and hurled it through the broken window. The bottle shattered on the porch, and flames erupted in a whoosh of orange light. Men screamed. One staggered back, his shirt ablaze, beating frantically at the flames. The others retreated from the porch, and the gunfire intensified. They were angry now, which made them dangerous and careless in equal measure. "Back door," Elena called out. Thomas spun and saw the door shuddering under repeated impacts. They were trying to batter it down. He fired 3 shots through the wood, spacing them low where a man's legs would be. A howl of pain confirmed at least 1 hit, and the battering stopped. But the respite was brief. Glass shattered in the kitchen, and Thomas saw a burning brand sail through. They were trying to burn them out. He grabbed the bucket of water he'd prepared and doused the flames before they could spread. But 2 more firebrands came through different windows. "They're trying to smoke us out," Elena coughed as acrid smoke began filling the room. Thomas made a split-second decision. Staying inside meant suffocation or burning. He grabbed his shotgun and a kerosene bottle. "When I go out the back, you cover the front. Don't let anyone through." "You're going outside?" Elena's voice was sharp with fear. "That's suicide." "Staying here is suicide." Thomas moved to the back door. "I'm going to make them think twice about those fires." Before she could argue further, he unbarred the door and burst through in a low run, immediately rolling left as bullets kicked up dirt where he'd been standing. He came up behind his water trough, using it for cover, and lit his bottle. The nearest Cortez man was 20 feet away, crouched behind a wagon preparing another firebrand. Thomas's bottle sailed through the air and exploded at the man's feet. Fire engulfed him, and his screams pierced the night as he ran blindly, crashing into his companions. Thomas used the chaos to sprint to his barn, bullets chasing him but missing in the darkness and confusion. Inside, he climbed to the loft and found a shooting position with clear sightlines to his house and the attackers' positions. From this vantage, he could see the true scope of the assault. 7 men were actively attacking. Victor and Drummond were hanging back, directing operations. Miguel was trying to organize a coordinated rush on the front door, while Carlos worked his way around to the east side. Thomas sighted carefully and fired. Miguel stumbled, clutching his shoulder. Not fatal, but enough to disrupt their coordination. He worked the bolt and fired again, forcing Carlos to abandon his flanking attempt and dive behind the woodpile. The attackers' attention shifted to the barn. Bullets tore through the wooden walls, and Thomas pressed himself flat in the loft, splinters raining down on him. He'd bought Elena precious seconds, but now he was pinned. Then he heard it, Rebel's distinctive bark, followed by a man's startled curse. The dog had joined the fight, attacking from the shadows, his teeth finding flesh. The man's scream suggests the arrival of the townspeople, transformed the battlefield into something else entirely. A public stage where Victor Cortez's carefully constructed empire could crumble under the weight of witnesses. Jack Patterson dismounted, flanked by men Thomas recognized. Henry Walsh, the shopkeeper, Doc Pritchard, Samuel Chen, who ran the general store, and others. They were armed, but their weapons remained holstered. They hadn't come to fight, they'd come to bear witness. "This is private business, Patterson," Victor snarled, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. "You're trespassing on a private dispute." "Private?" Jack's laugh was harsh. Half the town heard Billy's telegraph messages before he sent them. Word spread fast about what you're really doing out here. "Victor! Beating your daughter, selling her like livestock, burning down a neighbor's property. That's not private business, that's criminal." Drummond pushed forward, his face purple with rage. "I paid good money for that girl. She's mine by contract." "Contract?" Doc Pritchard spoke up, his voice cold with disgust. "Human beings can't be bought and sold, Drummond. That stopped being legal in this country 30 years ago. Whatever agreement you made with Cortez is void on its face." "She's his daughter," Drummond protested. "He has the right to arrange her marriage." "He has the right to suggest a marriage," Samuel Chen corrected. "Not to beat her into submission and hunt her down with armed men when she refuses. There's a word for that, slavery, and another word, kidnapping." Thomas watched as the Cortez hired guns began backing away, their hands carefully visible and empty. Professional gunfighters knew when a situation had turned untenable. Being paid to intimidate was one thing. Being witnessed committing felonies in front of a dozen townspeople was quite another. Victor seemed to realize he was losing control. "Diego, Miguel, Carlos, we're taking Elena and leaving. Now, anyone who interferes will answer to me." But his sons didn't move. Diego was clutching his wounded shoulder, his face pale. Miguel and Carlos exchanged glances, and Thomas could see the calculation in their eyes. Loyalty to their father versus self-preservation. "Father," Diego said quietly, "it's over. Too many people know. We need to leave before the marshal arrives." "I'm not leaving without her." Victor's composure shattered completely. He drew his pistol and aimed it at the house. "Elena, you have 10 seconds to come out or I start shooting." "Put the gun down, Victor." Doc Pritchard's voice was steady. "You're not thinking clearly. Whatever happens from here, it'll be worse if you fire that weapon." 10 seconds, Victor repeated, cocking the hammer. Thomas moved to put himself between the window and Elena, but she pushed past him. "No more hiding," she said firmly, then called out, "You want to shoot me, father? Do it in front of all these witnesses. Show them exactly what kind of man you are. Show them how the great Victor Cortez handles his business." Victor's hand trembled, the pistol wavering. In that moment, Thomas saw something flicker across the older man's face. Was it doubt, regret, or just the realization that he'd lost everything? The sound of more horses cut through the tension. Everyone turned toward the north road, and this time there was no mistaking the newcomers. A man in a dark suit rode at the head of the group, a silver star visible on his vest even in the firelight. Behind him came 6 mounted men, all armed, all clearly lawmen. "Federal Marshal James Dalton," the lead rider announced, his voice carrying authority that made even Victor lower his pistol. "Nobody move. This scene is now under federal jurisdiction." Relief flooded through Thomas so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd survived until help arrived. Marshal Dalton dismounted and surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen countless violent confrontations. His gaze took in the burning barn, the wounded men, the armed standoff, and finally settled on Victor Cortez. "Mr. Cortez," Dalton said evenly, "I've received some very serious allegations about your conduct. I'm going to need you and your men to disarm immediately." "This is a family matter," Victor began, but Dalton cut him off. "This is assault, attempted kidnapping, arson, and attempted murder. That's federal jurisdiction when it crosses county lines and involves interstate commerce, which your water rights disputes with Drummond certainly do." The marshal turned to his deputies. "Disarm everyone. Take statements from all witnesses." As the deputies moved to collect weapons, another rider emerged from the darkness, an older man in judicial robes, silver-haired and stern-faced. "Territorial Judge Arthur Morrison," he announced. "I've been apprised of the situation by telegraph. Mr. Cortez, Miss Cortez, Mr. Brennan, and Mr. Drummond, you'll all be giving testimony, starting now." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of statements, questions, and revelations. Elena told her story in full, showing her injuries, describing the beating and the forced marriage arrangement. Thomas corroborated everything, adding details about the siege and the attack. The townspeople provided their own accounts, how word had spread through Clearwater Springs about Victor's actions, how they'd come to ensure justice was done. Billy Patterson appeared with the original telegraph messages, proving they'd been sent to Helena as promised. Doc Pritchard examined Elena's injuries and provided medical testimony about the severity of the beating. "These are defensive wounds," he said, indicating bruises on her arms, "and these facial injuries are consistent with repeated blows from a fist. This wasn't an accident or a fall. This was a deliberate assault." Drummond tried to claim his contract with Victor was legitimate business, but Judge Morrison shut him down immediately. "Any contract involving the sale or forced marriage of a human being is void. Furthermore, Mr. Drummond, you're facing charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping. I suggest you retain legal counsel." Victor's defense crumbled piece by piece. His hired guns testified that he'd ordered them to retrieve Elena by any means necessary. His own sons, seeing which way the wind was blowing, admitted their father had beaten Elena and planned to force the marriage. As dawn broke over the Montana foothills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Marshal Dalton placed Victor Cortez under arrest. "Victor Cortez, you're charged with assault, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, arson, attempted murder, and violations of territorial law regarding forced marriage. You'll be transported to Helena to await trial." Thomas watched as they shackled Victor and loaded him into a wagon. The man who'd commanded such fear and respect just hours ago now looked smaller, older, broken. His empire had collapsed in a single night, because he'd valued control over his daughter's humanity. Drummond was arrested as well, along with 2 of the hired guns who'd actually fired at the house. Diego, Miguel, and Carlos were held for questioning but not immediately charged. Judge Morrison indicated their cooperation might work in their favor. As the prisoners were being loaded for transport, Victor looked back at Elena one final time. "You've destroyed everything," he said bitterly. "The ranch, the business, our family name, all of it gone because you couldn't do your duty." Elena met her father's eyes without flinching. "No, father, you destroyed it. The moment you decided I was property instead of a person, you destroyed everything that mattered. I just made sure everyone else knew it." Victor was led away in chains, and Elena turned to Thomas. In the growing daylight, he could see her fully, bruised, exhausted, but standing tall with a dignity that all of Victor's violence hadn't been able to break. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Judge Morrison approached before Thomas could answer. "Miss Cortez, you'll need to provide formal testimony at your father's trial. Until then, you're free to live where you choose. The Cortez estate will be held in trust pending the legal proceedings, but you have legitimate claim to your share of it." "I don't want anything from him," Elena said immediately. "Nevertheless, it's yours by right," Morrison replied. "Take time to heal, to think about your future. The law will ensure you're protected." He turned to Thomas. "Mr. Brennan, you showed considerable courage. The territory owes you a debt of gratitude." After the judge left, Thomas and Elena stood together watching the sun rise fully over the mountains. The night's violence seemed almost unreal in the clean morning light. Thomas's barn was a smoking ruin, several of his cattle lay dead in the field, and his house was riddled with bullet holes. But he was alive. They both were. "I need to rebuild," Thomas said, surveying the damage. "Barn, fences, replace the livestock. It'll take time." "I could help," Elena said tentatively. "I know ranching. I grew up on one before everything went wrong, and I have nowhere else to go, not really." Thomas looked at her, this woman who'd stumbled into his life less than 2 days ago and turned it completely upside down. "It's hard work, dawn to dusk, especially for a small operation like mine." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Elena replied. "And I'm not afraid of starting over. That's all I've wanted, a chance to build something that's mine, not something forced on me." Thomas found himself smiling despite his exhaustion. "Then I suppose I could use the help. Wages would be fair but modest until I get back on my feet." "Wages and a chance to be free," Elena said. "That's more than I had yesterday." They stood together as Clearwater Springs townspeople began dispersing, heading back to their own lives. Jack Patterson clapped Thomas on the shoulder as he passed. "You did good, Brennan. Real good. Town won't forget it." Doc Pritchard stopped to check Thomas's bullet graze and Elena's head wound. "Both of you need rest and proper food. Come by my office this afternoon. I want to check these injuries again." As the last of the witnesses left, Thomas and Elena walked toward the ruined barn, Rebel limping alongside them. The dog's wound had been treated by Doc Pritchard, and he'd survive with nothing more than another scar to add to his collection. "It's strange," Elena said. 12 hours ago I thought I was going to die. Now I'm free, my father's in custody, and I have a chance at an actual life. It doesn't feel real." "It's real," Thomas assured her, "and it'll still be real tomorrow when we wake up and have to start rebuilding all of this." He gestured at the destruction around them. "Good," Elena said firmly. "I want real, I want difficult. I want a life that's mine to live even if it's hard." They began walking back to the house, planning what would need to be done first, clearing debris, repairing the worst of the damage, tending to the remaining livestock. It was overwhelming, but there was something honest about it, something clean after the corruption and violence they'd just survived. Thomas paused at his door and looked back at the eastern mountains, watching the sun climb higher into a perfect blue sky. Somewhere in those mountains, Sarah was buried in the little cemetery behind the church where they'd married. He thought about what she would have said about the past 2 days, about the choice he'd made. She would have been proud, he decided, and she would have liked Elena, her strength, her refusal to surrender her dignity, her willingness to work for what she wanted. "Thank you," Elena said again, "for everything, for being the kind of man who does the right thing, even when it costs him everything." "Hasn't cost me everything," Thomas replied, surprising himself with the realization. "Still got my land, got my honor, and now I've got help rebuilding. Could be worse." Elena smiled, a real smile, the first he'd seen from her. "Could be worse," she agreed, "could be a lot worse." They went inside to clean up and rest, knowing the work ahead would be difficult, but facing it together. Outside, the Montana sun continued its climb into the sky, indifferent as always to human struggles, but somehow the morning felt different, cleaner, brighter, filled with possibility. Victor Cortez had tried to break his daughter's spirit and had instead lost everything. Thomas Brennan had risked everything to do what was right and had found something he hadn't expected: purpose, partnership, and hope for a future he'd thought died with Sarah. And Elena, Cortez, no longer anyone's property or pawn, had finally won the freedom to choose her own path, no matter how difficult that path might be. The story could have ended in tragedy: another woman broken by a man's cruelty, another small rancher crushed by the powerful. Instead, it ended with justice, with dignity preserved, and with two people standing together at dawn, ready to build something new from the ashes of what had burned. Sometimes, when you make your stand on principle, when you refuse to surrender to expedience or fear, the universe aligns in unexpected ways. Witnesses arrive, help comes, and the powerful find that their power has limits after all. Thomas and Elena had learned that lesson the hard way, through blood and fire and desperate courage. But they had learned it standing up rather than on their knees, and that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.